Thank you to Dr. Bruton as well as to the university, to the lecture series and the support, and also to all of you for coming. I really appreciate it. Warren Buffett has a phrase for which he's somewhat famous. He's said that in America, stocks are the only thing people don't want to buy on sale. We like to buy stocks when they're going up, when they've been going up for a while, not when they've been undervalued. And it is my belief, my strong belief, that Mississippi has been profoundly undervalued. We have reasons for that, and I'm going to talk about those. And then I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I came to develop a theory of democratic leadership, which I then applied to the state of Mississippi. That definition involves 4 key virtues that we find in Plato's Republic, but that I think we can understand democratically with some help of some modern thinkers. And then we can look at each of those virtues and attend to how they can possibly direct us for the sake of progress in Mississippi. Depending on how much time we have, I may only focus on a few of them, but we can talk more about others if you like. And as was mentioned, at 4 p.m. I'll be at Main Street Books for a book signing. And if you want to talk more, we can also talk there. So when you look at Mississippi and you see us, many are familiar with the line saying that, we're fed up with 50th, people will say. We have high child mortality, we have high teen pregnancy, we have high school dropout rates. We have a lot of challenges. When you consider the major forces at work, it's clear that poverty is a crucial issue. It's also clear that education is vital, and yet we struggle with both of those. In fact, arguably you could say we have a catch-22 in Mississippi. The catch-22 would be that it seems as though if you want to stimulate, let's say, the economy and get people out of poverty, you need to have a good education. But education is more difficult and challenging if you are living in poverty. Life is more stressful, right? Sometimes the only meals you get in a day are at school. And there's a number of factors which I'll come back to, which have made things difficult in Mississippi, and I think we can change some of those. But as a philosopher, I'm also an optimist. And it seems to me that being a pessimist, I won't make anything better. And the way that cashes out for me is to think that the catch-22 we have is apparent. And in other words, we have the appearance of a catch-22, but we can get out of it, I believe. Both the issues we have of poverty and of educational frustration appear to me to be rooted in a common problem which is in our culture. It's a radical problem of division in which people live separately in many ways. They care about things very separately. We fund things very differently. And at least we've had a big history of this, and there's been some combating of the problem of disunity, but we need considerably more work in that sphere. And there are things we can do. My fundamental thesis in Uniting Mississippi is a moral thesis. The idea is that if we have good democratic leadership, we can reconstruct this culture. We can look at particular elements of the culture we have and think about how we can make changes. Culture sounds like this fluffy idea, this very abstract notion. But if you think about its components, it's the language we use, it's the beliefs we hold, it's the practices we engage in, and it's in our institutions. So when you look at particulars, you can see tangible examples of culture. When I came to Mississippi and in a class, students and I were talking about corporal punishment. They told me that they had been struck in school, and I was taken aback because I thought that wasn't allowed anymore. Turns out it's allowed in 19 states, still in the United States. And I'll come back to that issue. But that's an example of a practice which is supported by public policy and which has an effect on the kinds of beliefs people are going to have, the ways they're going to think about and talk about education. right? So I say culture, but I mean things that are very concrete. They're also somewhat pervasive, so you have to have a holistic approach. And when people think about Mississippi and pursuing progress, so often we're incredibly piecemeal. We may make some progress here, but there's such a big set of problems that people become so frustrated. That's why I think it's vital that we consider the large goal that we're after and see what implications that larger goal has. So in thinking about Mississippi, when I first came to Mississippi, that was when I began work at the University of Mississippi in 2007. I was deeply interested in how to resolve the issues of poverty and education, like so many people are, right, interested in that. At the same time, I'm in a program, as has been mentioned, called Public Policy Leadership. Some of y'all are studying philosophy. I'm the philosopher in the department. We have another philosopher presently, but at the time I was the first philosopher hired there to teach ethics and public policy, critical thinking and communication for public policy. And I developed a course on the philosophy of leadership. I was dismayed when I looked for good philosophy of leadership resources to see how little there was, how little philosophers today are writing about the subject of leadership. I think there are reasons for that. It could be that guilt by association kind of understanding. You maybe have seen, perhaps some of you have a LinkedIn account, and folks post some aphorism or quote, and it sounds philosophical. It also, to anyone who thinks about it, sounds like nonsense. Sometimes they're really stupid quotes. They get posted on there. Sometimes they're lovely. But there are these books on leadership that get written sometimes in the business world. There are a few exceptions that are good, but so many are terrible. And I think there's a guilt by association about anybody who studies leadership that, oh Lord, they're doing that kind of stuff. There are some folks in psychology who've done some interesting work on leadership, some people in history, a couple of works have been important. But in philosophy, it's so rare. There are only a handful of people today who are writing on that. And so it seemed to me crucial to try and contribute to that. And the book that preceded Uniting Mississippi was called Democracy and Leadership. And so in that project, I was looking, and it was a direct inspiration for this one. So in the present, the latest book, I explain in a nutshell my theory of leadership, which I developed in the prior project. That one was for scholars. This one's for both scholars, but also aiming to talk to people in the public and say, let's talk about the ways in which Mississippi might make some progress using these ideas about leadership. So when thinking about democracy and leadership and the paucity of resources in the field of philosophy, it seemed to me to listen to the scholar who's a big hero to me, John Dewey. Dewey was a pragmatist, and he was also a democratic thinker. And yet he said the following: when people either are ignoring an important subject, or when their philosophical abstractions have become out of touch with real life, go back to Plato. He says there's often a need for a back to Plato movement, which is funny because Plato's not very democratic sometimes, right? Well, in thinking about philosophy of leadership, the clear source that was fascinating to me was Plato's Republic. And in that crucial text, maybe some of y'all have been studying this, Plato, in the interlocutors in the dialogue, clarified 4 key virtues of the good city. Naturally, which one would you think is the most important? Virtues. If you can throw out a name of a virtue for Plato, any of the students here, what would you think in his eyes is the most important? If you're a philosopher who loves wisdom, it's going to be wisdom, right? That is one of the first ones he brings up, and it is to him, in a sense, the most important. But in other senses, the others are crucial as well, and so I'll come back to that. So those 4 key virtues of the Republic include wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. So when I was thinking about, well, what should good leadership look like? It seems to me clearly good leadership should be wise. It should be courageous. It should be moderate. Insofar as you can't get something done without having the unity work together, if you have too much extremism, the unity pulls itself apart. When you're being judicious, you've got to be wise. When you're being judicious, you've got to be moderate. And also when you're being judicious, you have to be just, it seems to me. But one can sort of perhaps take too much time in thinking through what to do, right? Sometimes you've got to act. You don't want to act too soon, because then you're brash. If you say, I'm not afraid of those enemies on the other side of the hill, and you rush over with your company, you may all get slaughtered, right? Whereas if you wait until nightfall, American soldiers have night vision goggles, and the other folks are sort of standing there looking out in the dark. We have incredible power, right, and ways to protect our troops' lives, to diminish risk when they have to act. And so you want to act, you don't want to act brashly, but at the same time, one can be judicious, but also drag his or her feet, and therefore, you need courage, right? Because the dragging of the feet would be cowardice in contrast with the brashness. So therefore, judiciousness and courage gets me down to two words, but then I also want to talk about guidance, right? So I call good leadership judicious yet courageous guidance. Might fit on a bumper sticker. So in thinking about the philosophy of leadership, I had also, in tangent, not at the same time, this was unintentional that these would come together, I had been thinking about writing and researching Mississippi poverty and educational frustrations all along, and it seemed obvious to me, finally, okay, I should put these together, and this should be my test case for thinking about, okay, what can good democratic leadership do for Mississippi in this apparent catch-22? So this is where I come to thinking about those four virtues that I mentioned in application to Mississippi's challenges. And the first one, as I mentioned, is wisdom. Again, these things can sound fluffy, and therefore it's crucial, I think, for us to consider how they're concrete. We have an awful lot of wisdom about what works with regard to certain problems we have. In particular, I'm thinking of sex education. There are those who don't want sex education to be comprehensive in the public schools for various reasons, interesting philosophical reasons. When you ask the question, however, what's most effective, yes, you can say that abstinence-only education has some positive results in some studies. They're narrow in particular at certain ages, which are after the start of sexual activity. And therefore, kids who are having sex aren't yet even seeing that abstinence-only education. Maybe you could start it earlier, but that hasn't been shown to have an effect, a positive effect. By contrast, we know that comprehensive or more comprehensive sex education, of course tailored appropriately according to what some people think is appropriate, for age, right, has been shown to be radically more effective at diminishing the transmission of sexual diseases, as well as unintended pregnancies. So there's an area in which Mississippi, until fairly recently, I think 2011, Mississippi schools public schools, didn't have to have even a policy about sex education. Then HB 999, the House bill on the subject, came out and was passed and eventually became law. And it said that each school district had to pick a policy for sex education. It could pick either abstinence-only education, or it could pick abstinence plus. So plus isn't comprehensive. And here's an example of that difference. The law explicitly says that you cannot do condom demonstrations. Condoms are extremely effective at reducing transmission of sexual diseases and at reducing unintended pregnancies, but only if you use them right. And you would think, oh, it's easy, except that this is why we educate on the subject. People put them on backwards, and people often don't pinch the tip to leave room for stuff to go, right? And teaching of that is forbidden in the law. There have been studies of what Mississippians want, by the way, so before I get to what I think is the biggest problem, there have been studies of what Mississippians want. The Mississippi Center for Health Policy did a survey of 3,000 Mississippians. For y'all, the students who are watching the presidential debates, notice how many people are surveyed when we want to make a generalization about America, which has 300 million people. About how many are in the survey? Have you noticed? About 1,000. Okay, if you ask 1,000 people, the issue is, the more people you ask at a certain point, you don't really improve likelihood of prediction. So you just, why spend all that money if you're not going to get much more precise results? Right? That's why we stopped at 1,000. Fair enough. Mississippi Center for Health Policy had enough money. They surveyed 3,000 people. That survey of 3,000 people was intended to make a prediction of 3 million Mississippians' beliefs. Okay? And so it was radically well populated as a survey. And it found that 70% of Mississippians want condoms demonstrations in the classroom. 70%. The percentage that want the more comprehensive, not necessarily talking about condoms, was much higher even. Now here's the thing about the policies that I was mentioning, where the law says you've got to pick either abstinence only or abstinence plus. If your child is in a school district where abstinence only is selected, you cannot get the more comprehensive curriculum for your child. By contrast, if your school district picks abstinence plus, and you don't want your child to be taught that plus stuff, you can opt out. So in this case, people can get what they want either way. In this case, that isn't true. So we could have had a policy which required abstinence plus education, but we didn't. Now, when I say required, with an opt-out policy. If you have an opt-out policy, your kids don't have to get things you don't want them to get, right? What was chosen was this option, and therefore we have kids of parents who want their kids to get comprehensive sex education who don't have the option because of the decision of the leadership of that school district. The law could have been written differently, and we can change that still. That isn't so difficult to conceive of changing. We already have the curriculum. So often our challenges in Mississippi to get progress seem to be focused on funding. This isn't a funding issue, except if we have far more teens who are pregnant, are they more or less likely to graduate from high school? Less, right? So it's an economic issue. In fact, it's been shown that teen pregnancies cost Mississippi in the avenue of $150 million a year. This was from Mississippi First, put out that data. So, wisdom, it seems to me, would look at our problems. It would consider the philosophical debates, right? About what should and shouldn't be taught in public schools, for instance. And some people don't think the school should be doing X, maybe. So there's debates to be had. Again, at the very least, you don't have to have that for your children with an opt-out policy. But consider that there's another issue in our schools, which I think wisdom, in terms of the best knowledge available, would tell us to do things differently. And that has to do with this issue I mentioned of corporal punishment. In the Oxford, Mississippi School District, they don't allow it. In Hattiesburg's school district, my understanding is they don't allow it. The county, they probably do, right? The county, Lafayette County, which surrounds Oxford, does permit it. In 2009 to 2010, that county had 7 recorded cases of corporal punishment. There's a document from Southern Echo, which is a nonprofit, and it has cataloged and has a wonderful map of all the different counties and their recorded usage. So if you're a parent in Lafayette County, maybe you don't think it's that big a deal, 7 recorded cases, right? In the next year, 2010 to 2011, there were 0 in Lafayette County. So how big a deal is this issue for you in Lafayette County? Maybe not as big a deal. A few counties over, in South Panola, where Batesville is, in 1 year, which is a 180-day school year, there were 2,572 recorded cases in not that big a school district, compared with Jackson or South Haven, for instance. Right? Those are much bigger. Jackson doesn't allow it, by the way. South Haven does, and they had about 3,000. But consider that's a much larger population. South Panola is not that big. 2,572 cases. And if you were to divide that by 180 school days and by 7 to 8 hours a day, you're talking roughly every 20 minutes a day. Every day the school's open, kids are being struck and that's being recorded. So I mentioned earlier that the problems of poverty and educational frustration have common roots, it seems to me, in culture. This is an example, a palpable, sadly tangible example of culture, where the beliefs we have lead us to certain practices, and those practices have consequences. There is really good data on what happens to a population when they are struck in schools. I'm not talking about in the home. I'm talking about in the schools. Schools which, one would hope, are tasked with cultivating in young people the ability to think critically. One of the things, by the way, involved, of course, in thinking critically is asking questions. One of the principal effects of corporal punishment is to diminish the tendency to ask questions. In the studies, we have clear evidence which show associations between corporal punishment in the schools and subsequent drug use, incarceration, and unemployment. Right? Controlled studies where we've seen that there is such a difference. In schools, you can only control so much, fair enough. But it's because we don't want to treat children like lab rats. Now, these cultural differences are difficult to change, right? But there are tools we have. Folks will say, for instance, spare the rod, spoil the child. Right? And therefore, why don't you apply that in schools? So I asked a priest this question. He said the following to me. Which rod do you think we're talking about? He said, it's the shepherd's rod. I've never seen a shepherd, he said to me, punish a sheep. You direct the sheep. Tap. Right? Spare the rod, spoil the child. Don't stop directing the child, then you'll spoil the child. But he argued anyway, this is a Catholic priest who was himself against the practice in schools. So we have, it seems to me, cultural tools available. It isn't that everybody agrees religiously on these kinds of things. But when you think about that kind of reasoning, which I've offered, and then consider that Mississippi is known to be the most Christian state in America, we have resources, or this is at least the most self-proclaimed Christian state in the nation, right, in surveys. We have resources where people say they believe the same thing, at least in certain statements of belief. We have some overlap, some shared values that can be drawn on. Changing policies about corporal punishment wouldn't cost money. Now, it is possible that if you were to change that policy, we might get a dumber alternative or another bad alternative. In Meridian, Mississippi, schools don't use corporal punishment. What they do instead is they call the police, even over the most minor of infractions. If your pants are a little low, the police have been called. This is true. The U.S. Department of Justice sued Meridian, Mississippi for having created, as they said, a school-to-prison pipeline. Think about the cultural roots of the problems we have. What are you doing when you acclimate a child? That child becomes accustomed to meeting the police and being treated as though his or her clothing even is a crime. That's not a better alternative. But we have studies and centers. There's a Center for Effective Discipline in Ohio, right? and the Gunderson Institute funds them. And they have lots of information about alternative approaches, which are more effective, don't have the long-term damaging features, and also which focus on avoiding shutting down kids' inclination to ask questions. I mentioned John Dewey as one of my heroes, right? It was his belief that one of the core obligations, intellectual obligations we have as scholars is to cultivate in the wider public, and he didn't just mean kids, right? In the wider public, the scientific attitudes and habits of mind for critical thinking. I think he's right about that, and I believe that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that corporal punishment, to support the claim, it seems to me that corporal punishment is one of those policies which undermines that really important goal. So far I've only talked about really two policies, if you think about it, right? But it seems to me we have tremendous knowledge in terms of social science studies about how things could be done better, and we're not doing them those ways. And they're not so contentious, needing tons of money to do. So it seems to me, again, that's incremental change, each one of those things, but what you got to do is to think about the overarching problem of the culture and to start looking at all the implications of that, and these are just a few of those. Now the second virtue I mentioned, so let me move on. I was just talking about wisdom. We have lots of wisdom about a number of different issues, and we could use that wisdom more wisely, more courageously, really, right? And that's the next one, which is courage. Courage, according to Plato, is akin to what I was telling you about with regard to the soldiers and the military company. The issue isn't that you lack fear. If you lack fear, you might be like that brash commander I mentioned to you who charges over the hill only to get everyone slaughtered. Plato argued that courage is not the absence of fear. So in other words, you can be plenty afraid and exhibit courage. Courage is fearing the right things and not the wrong things. So I use that definition all the time in my critical thinking communication class, in which students have to give public speeches. In 2001, there were two things that Americans were most afraid of. The first one was snakes, and the second one was public speaking. The saying goes that people would rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy. So when I talk with students, I ask, look, which is worse? Is it worse to stumble on some words and maybe have someone laugh at you? Or is it worse to have only someone who's wrong do the speaking? Right? It's terrible to speak well and be wrong, said Sophocles. No, that was Epictetus, right? No, that was Sophocles. Sorry. I'm thinking of the quotes I like to repeat, and that one was Sophocles. It's terrible to speak well and be wrong, so we should be afraid of people convincing us of the wrong thing. And therefore we need critical thinkers who aren't afraid of being laughed at a little bit, right? The big thing that students always need to practice is being comfortable with the silence, which lets a thought sink in, which lets you find the next words you want to say. People are panicked when they're silent, so they say, But if you fear the right thing, right, you shouldn't fear taking a silence to think, because what do you look like you're doing when you pause? What do you think? You look like you're thinking. Does that look stupid or does that look smart? Right. So this is what I get from Plato. Fear the right things, not the wrong things. If you think about it right, you won't fear the wrong things. And yes, you may fear them at first. But like all these things, when you get to the virtue tradition and philosophy, it takes practice. You don't start good at tennis, right? You always have to practice these things. So you start somewhere and you keep doing it. There's a reason why reverends like MLK get so good at speaking. They do it every Sunday. So, courage is the second virtue that I was describing, and I think could make a big difference in Mississippi. I think there's a lot of places in which we can see the need for courage in Mississippi. One of them is to have the right fear, not the wrong fear, when it comes to the the small minority that is the loudest set of mouths. Sex education was an example of that, right? People are really afraid of that cousin so-and-so or that aunt, so-and-so, who really have strong views about this, are going to make you feel terrible about it and give you a hard time all the time, when you might think something reasonable. Right? So you either don't talk about it or you let things be as they are. Right? On campus at the University of Mississippi, I like to use examples of what my students have done, because it seems to me they have been more courageous than some leaders in Jackson. Just last semester, we had students reacting to the changes in South Carolina and in Alabama about the Confederate battle flag, which is in the canton of the state of Mississippi. There are students who are calling our university to take it down. I appreciate there's debates about this. Had the students been rash and acted right without fear, they might have gone and climbed and torn the thing down and done vandalism and just done horrible things, maybe broken some windows, whatever. Those are the kinds of things that are brash. What the students did instead is they organized discussion meetings. The students organized the discussion meetings. They got people together who included sons of the Confederate veterans and who included some other folks and had some professors talk about history and giving us the facts, man, right? And we had that. We had discussion and debate. And then the student body got together in the longest recorded student body leadership meeting, I imagine, in the university's history, in which they repeatedly, over and over, asked again for more and more time when each person was making their case about what they wanted. Right? Lots of students were very afraid to say what they thought. They were just going to let things go as they were. But in hearing other people explain what things were like for them, right? These students spoke up. And by the way, I should add that at these rallies and before, there have been protests from Klansmen and from members of the League of the South. And these people came to our campus with loaded shotguns in their cars. This has been found, and they were put in prison for that put in jail for that for a short period. Can't have loaded weapons in a vehicle within 1,000 feet of. Anyway. So the students had threats of violence. One man put a bomb in Walmart, which wasn't successful, fortunately. It isn't that he wasn't trying to blow something up. There was the stuff to blow up. It was not wired correctly. It didn't blow up properly. Why Walmart? Because Walmart stopped selling Confederate battle flags. And they were one of the early ones to change. Now, at the university, these students were, especially the NAACP members, who won an award for this, by the way, and some members of the College Democrats. Is this a partisan issue? Some people want to say yes. I tell you, one of the first people to speak up was Senator Wicker, Republican senator of Mississippi. I met him 2 weeks ago. He says it's the right thing to do. Respect our symbols with museums, right, and honor our traditions, but look forward. Okay? He convinced Senator Cochran, Republican from Mississippi, right? Phil Gunn is not a liberal. If y'all know the Speaker of the House, he spoke up saying we probably need a change. I understand that this is something people still feel passionate about and are concerned about. Here's my question: is it or is it not a symbol of division? It was literally, explicitly intended to be a symbol of division. I'm not talking about hatred. I'm talking about division. It's definitely a symbol of division, explicitly, right? When it came to segregation, was it a symbol of division? It was a symbol of division, yet again. In 2014, the old Georgia flag was draped over the statue of James Meredith at the University of Mississippi. The old Georgia flag, 2/3 of it is the Confederate battle flag, right? The old Georgia flag. It was draped over the shoulders of James Meredith's statue along with the noose. Is it a symbol of division? Who was protesting vehemently and loudly with signs that say Black lives don't matter? Who was, right, this is a symbol of division. I appreciate that it will divide people that call for uniting. But the question is, how do you unite people? It's got to be with the culture. Do I think changing the flag is going to change people's hearts today? Absolutely not. But symbols matter. And over time, with habits and practice, things can change to some degree. And we can tell ourselves we want to be united, even if some people are loud and, right, and scaring folks with weapons, with nooses, and so forth. 18 and 20-year-old students resisted that and exhibited the kind of courage I'm talking about. One last thing about that. Governor Haley of South Carolina is no liberal. She gave the response to Obama not long ago, right? About the State of the Union. She presided over taking down the Confederate battle flags in South Carolina. The governor of Alabama took them down like that. We could do that. We could do that. We aren't doing that. It seems to me it takes courage. It takes not just, it isn't, I don't think that people are just too afraid. I think they're fearing the wrong things and not the right things. That's an example of the issues regarding courage. And as I said, moderation is the third virtue, right? Moderation is the virtue by which we achieve unity. We keep the city together rather than torn apart. There's a lot of ways in which we can moderate differences. I think I'm supposed to end at 45 minutes. Is that right, Sam?
Yes.
So I'm going to wrap up. And,
okay.
And if you want more on moderation and justice, it's in the book. Okay? Moderation, it seemed to me as I was thinking about the virtues of leadership, is the vital one in a way. It's vital for justice. It's vital for us to get to use the wisdom we need. Of course, courage, all the virtues are important. And even for Plato, he'll value wisdom highest. But you can be really smart and studying all you want and never willing to put your foot out the door. Right? You need courage. You need these other things. These other virtues matter very much to achieve the progress you need. And if you want to see an example of the ways in which things can go differently, look at the two states with the highest amount of lynching in the South, Mississippi and Georgia. And then look at the kinds of change that we saw in Jackson and in these are radically different cities. People live in different parts of Atlanta, but in Atlanta. People care about Atlanta, right? Maynard Jackson was the first black governor of Atlanta. His daughter was in my class in high school. Wonderful. And we had a really smart mayor of Atlanta who was very good at unifying the people there. We have so much business in Atlanta. My folks are there still. It's crazy how successful they have been. There is a relationship between the success at bringing about greater unity. No, it's not done, but there needs to be greater unity to then inspire people to want to come there. We have low taxes. We have low regulation. We have cheap land. We have cheap labor. But we need to agree that we've got to put more effort into education. We've got to support people better so they're more ready for school and success. To then have people say, yes, we're going to come bring our company there. By the way, the day that the governor of Alabama announced the taking down of the Confederate battle flags, in the same moment, he announced the $600 million Google facility that was being installed. Now, I don't have proof that those two things are related, and it was denied, but I doubt it. I suspect there is a relationship when Google was deciding whether or not to install their facility, and this was going on. The governor of Alabama said, I don't want people to think we're stuck in 1962. The question is, should Mississippi want to be stuck in 1962? I think very much that Mississippi's stock is undervalued. I think there's so much we can do. A lot of it won't cost much. Some of it we should invest in, damn it, and we should care about everybody's kids. This is part of the problem. My kids are great in Oxford. What about the kids in South Canova? We need unity for us to care about everybody's kids, and when we do that, I think we're going to see tremendous growth in the state of Mississippi. And that's what the book's about.
Field questions themselves, so fire away.
Yes.
So, and you may go on to explain this in the book and through the lecture about justice, but how do you tackle the universal justice in the sense that not everyone is aligned in the same degree? Because you spoke a lot from the perspective of from the one-sided normative position that there is a right or wrong way to go to this, especially with flag, which is extremely and deeply divided.
Right.
So how do you answer that unity in the vision for justice?
Well, I think you can use examples. In that sense, I'm more Aristotelian than Platonic. Okay? Aristotle, oh Lord, he loved his examples. And the troubling example for me is when you look at 2012, when James Craig Anderson was the target of a racially charged intended murder. And he was driven over by the truck of Darrell Dedman. There were a number of people in his group who would regularly go to Jafrica, they called it, which was Jackson, of course. As they called it, this was in the record of the case. And they would shoot metal ball bearings at African Americans on the street from their trucks. I think that there are shades of a lot of issues, but there's so many that are just stark. And this is an example of one of them. If you haven't yet had the chance, I strongly urge you to read Judge Carlton Reeves' speech, which is famous, by the way. NPR called it breathtaking. It is. It took my breath away to read Judge Carlton Reeves' speech. He's an African-American U.S. District Court judge from Mississippi. Controversial on a couple issues. I asked him, did you get a lot of hate mail or attacks about this case in which he was an African-American judge sentencing the racially charged murder of James Craig Anderson? And he said, no, I got no criticism for that. I got criticism for the parent school issue. I got criticism for the same-sex marriage decisions, right? So there are going to be things that are more contentious, for sure. And what we need is open debate with great education for us to all think critically together. I don't think I should impose the right answer I think that we should accept on this or that issue. We need to talk about it, and we need to convince each other, which I do want to try and do, is convince people. But on some issues, it's clear how we should be thinking about justice. And for an example that is not so, violent, at least physically violent, in Canton County, Mississippi, not far from Jackson, in 2007, it was reported that the proportion of students who had entered as freshmen and were still there as seniors, we call that retention, was 32%. You want your kid to have those odds? That is devastating. Now, they've made changes. My suspicion is that the shame which came when they were the worst of the group is part of what really motivated change. I think Kwame Anthony Appiah is really onto something on the Honor Code book he wrote, where he said that moral revolutions are prompted especially by issues of honor and respect. Anyway, so I think that motivated Canton to make some changes, and they're, at least on paper, doing better. I hope they're really doing better. But if you look at the next set of counties, Amity County and so forth, they were in the 40%. So it isn't that I think we need to have 100%. There are going to be people who go different routes. We need freedom to make decisions, and sometimes that means messing up. But that is a 99% African-American school, right? Where people live in poverty, and we just have appalling results in that school, where we did. And I think that's a really stark example where everybody spat out their coffee when they read that. You know, so we have shades of gray in a lot of places. We need to figure out what to do. Fair enough. We also have some stark examples. I hope that addresses your concern.
So the democracy that you described is without structural constraints, right? It exists in the culture, but in kind of reality of Mississippi, our democracy is structured by things like political parties, and those political parties package the issues that you're talking about, right? We don't actually make decisions about corporal punishment or sex education on this kind of one-by-one basis. We instead vote for political parties who package that with things that people feel strongly about: gun rights, to anti-science rhetoric, to taxes, and all of these other things. And then I'm wondering how you see us getting past those kind of structural barriers to this kind of pure democracy that you're discussing.
A very interesting question. So I really appreciate that you recognize that the democracy I'm emphasizing is especially cultural. That is what it is for Dewey. He doesn't necessarily want every decision to be made by the masses of people. First of all, it'd be cumbersome. We've got things to do. We need elected officials. And therefore, when he talks about democracy, it's about the culture, just as you say. So what does that mean? Well, it has to do with beliefs about what citizens are supposed to be in our society, among other things. It has to do with that, right? And a clear distinction needs to be made between a society which seems highly hierarchical, with stages of citizenship. My son has one-sixth the likelihood of going to prison than any African-American man. 1/6, so 6 times more, right? So those are structural problems. People are starting to talk about incarceration. I'm really happy to see, right? But so how do you change this? Excellent question. We have to be yelling about it and talking about it, and then people are thinking about it when they get called on the phone by those darn surveys and ask what they think about things. Hopefully they'll say the right things. And so we need to speak up and talk. And this is why Dewey was this great public philosopher, because he had a lot of very difficult and long abstract texts, but he also wrote some beautiful punchy articles for the newspaper, right? And he wanted to convince people of things. He wanted people to hear what he thought the greatest wisdom had to offer. And then, if you want to win office, yes, the parties put together these platforms, but if they have any brains, then they try to win sometimes, right? They should draw and try to draw sometimes on surveys as best they can. And so we need to talk to people. We need to get the word out. I think social media has made things profoundly more possible than they ever were before, with some costs, sure. But reaching people and getting them to think about issues is far more possible today than it ever used to be. And therefore, when parties are putting together those platforms, I want them to think about these things, which is why I write a book and I'm putting articles in the paper about these very issues. In fact, there's a number of appendix articles that I attached as appendices documents that were in the Clarion Ledger at the end of the book on many of these subjects. So it's no guarantee. We need good leadership in the parties, right? But I'm working with students in public policy leadership. One of them was Garrett Jackson, who was Mitt Romney's body man. I was sitting at dinner 2 weeks ago with a young woman from Memphis who went to Ole Miss. She got a call from the White House to work with Michelle Obama, right? I've got students working with Senator Wicker, Senator Cochran, Congressman Kelly, right? Our students are in positions, and these young people go get those jobs, right? And we need to push them and encourage them to do that. And in fact, one of the other things, I really encourage my students to write for the paper. If you want to get a sense of what the humanities can do for you, take what you learn in your class and write 500 words, 300 words, and send that to the paper and say, I think things should be this way, right? I appreciate this, but here's what we ought to do for greater justice, right? And when you speak up, that jerk isn't in that spot, at least, right? And you've offered your ideas. This is what it means to contribute to that culture. And hell, if you just tweet about it, raising concerns, that can reach a lot of people.
You spoke in your talk about the Confederate flag being a sign of division. At least, what would you say about it being a sign of hatred?
About it being a sign of hatred, I think there are people who don't think about its history much. I think there are people who say they care about heritage, but then if you show them historical documents, they tell you you're cherry-picking statements, or that, oh, that's what the legislature said. The legislature put out a declaration, Mississippi's declaration of its immediate causes for secession. Fortunately, these things are digitized and online and beautiful, and you can see them. It lays out that first sentence. I wish I could say it was the first sentence. The first sentence says, in order to basically be civilized people, we have to give us our declaration for why we're doing something. The next sentence is the first answer. Our reasons for seceding are fundamentally entwined with the cause of slavery, the greatest human economic interest in the world. It was explicitly joining the Confederacy. If any state wants to say that its adoption of the Confederate flags and symbols wasn't about slavery, well, it did in Mississippi, because Mississippi was explicit. Right? And then I'll hear people say, oh, well, those were the legislators. You know, my ancestors were farmers and so forth. Well, sure, but they joined the cause. They sure joined the cause of what the legislatures called us to do, to defend slavery. It's clear. There's no doubt about that. I have students read that and say, oh, okay, well, that's what Mississippi says. But you got to get people to look at that. And some people will be shown that and they'll just ignore it. And, you know, if you read your Plato, and in particular Plato's Republic, remember, what does Plato say about the images we get? We have a sign, we're chained and looking at the symbol on the wall that someone has made to look like what I want it to look like, or I've come to believe that it's that. Right? What did he say when the philosopher comes back into the cave and tries to tell you, look, behind you, that's just a shadow of something, right? He said they'll be mad at you and they'll kill you. Exactly right. They'll be furious, but he didn't say, so leave them there. He said we have a responsibility to go back to the cave. And he took that responsibility all the way. Good question.
You've spoken about how we can make various things better. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how can we make our election process better?
Ooh.
Yeah, it's like, I hate election time in Mississippi. So I usually turn off my TV, but occasionally I'll hear a political ad, and every time I hear a political ad, I think, I want to go to the other guy. And if I hear the other guy's ads, I want to think the same thing. We have an awful process of election.
I have a joke answer for you, and then I'll think sincerely about it. If you want to feel better about our election process, visit Ohio. Visit a swing state. My in-laws live in Ohio. The phone is ringing constantly, a year in advance. I mean, it's insane how people are fighting for the swing states. So much money goes into Ohio, Florida, a few of those states, right? Oh, that's hell there. So if you were to go there, you might feel a little bit better about Mississippi. But no, these are good questions. How do we improve the election process? Well, for one thing, I hope we'll have better and better candidates. The other thing is, there's a wonderful line from Plato in Book 1 of the Republic. He says it's the greatest punishment for those unwilling to rule, to be ruled by those who are worse. So what he's saying is, get off your tuchus, right? Go get in that party. If you think the party's no good, do it better. And that's not a very satisfying answer for people who just want others to make it better, but he's on to something. We've got to participate. In Mississippi, a state employee can't run for a public office. That's a rule I would change. Yeah, you would have to, I don't know if you can take a leave of absence and run. I don't know about that. I haven't looked into it. I don't know if that helps, but that's Plato's answer anyway.
Turn off the TV.
Well, I will say this. I really don't like watching TV news. Mainly, I tell people because I don't like to have my news yelled at me. And therefore, I read my news. And I find that much more palatable. So it may be that you got to turn off the TV, but you might find a really great writer whom you love to read, or frankly, write for the paper and send in your thoughts, and maybe you can change some minds. One might hope, right?
Another couple questions, perhaps? Anybody?
What role, there's a book, and I can't remember the author of the name, it's on leadership, and one of the crucial things about leadership is that you look to see elsewhere who is succeeding and how they're succeeding about specific matters. And it seems to me a problem in Mississippi is that we've got this kind of metaphysics of atomic individualism, where people, this rugged individualism where you don't need anybody and you don't go anywhere else to share to learn from other associations and institutions and other practices, which seems to me the opposite of what Dewey says in Democracy in Education, where you get enriched by going through these associations and institutions. And years ago, I was on a general education requirements committee here, and I got charged with looking at what other universities were doing. And I was amazed at how many good things were going on, not all in one university, but I looked through 50 different universities. And I was amazed at how you could pull a lot of these out directly to improve USM, or modify them to improve USM. And I'll shut up in a second, but and Wake Forest went from that ranking of, they were like 147, and they went down to, I think, 37, because they got a new president in. And this guy looked around and said, look, this is what we can do. And he took $500,000 out of the presidential contingency fund, created a course in the art department for art seniors and art faculty, and had them study. It was a course on contemporary art. And they would make a trip after the end of this course. They were given $500,000 to go to the galleries in New York City and buy artwork for the little museum, which became bigger and bigger. And that started bringing tourists in, and as far as I know, they're still doing that. That's one of many things that he did. But it seems to me the problem here is this, now you mentioned this right off, this kind of atomic individualism, where you think, well, I'm ready-made, I'm all I need, maybe part of leadership is to look around, as this MIT book says, look around, see how you can pull things in here. And usually these are things that people like, a lot of them are. So,
well, to jump in, there's an example which presented itself really clearly for me as I thought about progress for Mississippi, which was South Africa. That Carlton Reeves, the judge I mentioned to you, I was blown away by his speech. I emailed him and asked him to come meet with my class. He did. Right? It was wonderful. Such a cool experience. Amazing guy. At one point at lunch with our students, we brought up South Africa. And he says, do you think a Truth and Reconciliation Commission could work here? That's an example of thinking about something which has been successful elsewhere. And we have many similarities if you look at the problems in terms of division, poverty, race, right, to South Africa. And they've made a lot of progress with some great leadership, which involved that very issue. So if we were to have something, it would of course need to be appropriately sensible for Mississippi to think about doing. And I don't know what that would look like yet, but that's what we need scholarship to be thinking about. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we have some policy that we use a little bit, in which we support some people to get an education and then have them thereby commit to serving the community that's disadvantaged. I think we could do a lot more of that. We have such need. We have to put money either on the back end to treat the issue, or ideally on the front end to avoid it. It seems to me we could fill a lot of needs with scholarships for y'all if some of you would be willing to live in Como for a few years. Como has 1,200 people. About half an hour, 45 minutes south of Memphis. That's just an example of the place where it's really hard to get teachers. It's really hard to get guidance counselors. It's really hard to get certain things, right? But college is expensive. If we can make it cheaper while filling our needs, helping our young people, and thereby exposing them, that's not an example of them seeing it done better, but it is an example of them seeing something else, where once you leave that experience, it seems to me, you're going to have a far wiser sense of what you're voting on in the booth. right? I definitely think we can look elsewhere. And I have a piece about well, the prospects for Mississippi and that I believe there are for doing as South Korea did with broadband internet everywhere. I think Mississippi could really shrink distances with an investment in infrastructure for broadband internet, which then industry can run. It's a support for business. Any individual industry doesn't have an interest in putting, high-speed internet in the Delta. But once it's already there as an infrastructure, it's easy for them to offer, right? That's another example of where I looked at another country and thought, we could do something like that. But I appreciate the question. South Africa is one answer, I think, and I think there is a lot we can do to imitate success elsewhere.
One last, John?
This is more of an observation. You mentioned that one thing that you thought would improve our elected system would be to allow state employees to run for government. I'm sure you're also aware that the Mississippi Constitution specifically precludes people who do not believe in a supreme being from running for public office in the state.
True, I did know that. My suspicion is if anyone ever tried to have that keep someone out of office, it would lose. However, would it lose too late for this election? Maybe it might for that election, but then, assuming you survive, there's another one. There's another one.
It violates federal law.
It does. Yeah,
It's still there.
that's a doozy. Yeah.